for learning is. We'll take a step back a bit to look at some of the big picture issues, including legal, technical, and cultural perspectives that play key roles in our approaches to accessibility. So we'll be hearing from Patricia Fleming, who is the co-chair of COSD, the Cuny Council on Student Disability Issues, and she's also the director of Baruch's Student Disability Services. Jessica Murray is with us too. She's a doctoral student in developmental psychology at the Grad Center and a Futures Initiative Fellow. And she has extensive experience with designing accessible websites and providing support for best practices in web design. And Jay Polish is with us. Jay is not only the program associate for LaGuardia's Designing for All project, but they are an author of young adult novels, a grad student humanities fellow with research interests in the intersections of disability, race, and trauma, and an adjunct professor of English and theater at LaGuardia. So welcome, and we'll start with Patricia.
Thank you so much. Everyone can hear me, yes? Okay. The earlier presentations were about basic day-to-day operation of a disability office, so this is a little drier. It's about how we do what we do, how we inform ourselves and when we have to make a decision or why someone doesn't have an accommodation. Priscilla just mentioned before, there are many students who go to the disability office and actually don't get accommodations. Well, why is that? Why can't any student who walks into the office get accommodations? So we are guided by some Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And I'm going to talk about that for a few minutes, and I will go through it quickly. I'll give you some examples. I'll try to make it a little listener-friendly, and then we can talk a little bit about how we can all do better at the university. So I won't bore you to death, okay? No yawns. So what is the definition? So who is a person with a disability? So a qualified individual with a disability, and you can refer to the screens because this is the actual language, so you can be reading along as I'm saying it. And actually, before I start, I would like to say that I am a white female, about 5'5". I wear glasses, I have brown hair to my shoulders, and that's it. So you can visualize, and I have a blue shirt on and beige pants. So you can visualize me in case you can't see me fully. So a qualified individual with a disability is a student who meets the academic and the technical standards for admission. So in other words, a student has applied to school, has applied to university with or without a disability, and they've been accepted. So the disability is one side, but they've actually been accepted. They have to meet the criteria of the university. We can't say, because you have a disability, we're going to lower the standard and you can get in. Everybody else needs an SAT score of 700, but you only got 650, but you have a disability, so that's okay. It doesn't work like that. You have to meet the actual standards of admission. Now, of course, some CUNY schools don't have a standard, and it's just a local diploma from a high school. So for qualifying students, reasonable accommodations are adjustments to the policy, practice, or programs that level the playing field. So that provides equal access to a student who has a disability, okay? And those are basically the accommodations, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that. Students with disabilities have accommodations. So Section 504 of the Rehab Act of 1973, it prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs that are conducted by federal agencies. So if you receive any funding from Washington, you actually are subject to the Rehab Act of 73. And this also, of course, colleges do get funding, so that's why we are affected. This was signed into law by President Nixon, in case anyone would like to know, a little tidbit. So the Rehab Act, the Section 504 states that no qualified individual with a disability in the United States shall be excluded from, denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity that receives financial assistance. So this refers to federal agencies, employment, and government contractors, but it also refers to education because, again, we do accept funding from the government, so we are subject to this. So there are two parts to Section 504 which relate to, Section 504 is massive, but there are two parts that relate specifically to education. One is 104, which is the treatment of students, so that's the general, and then 104.44 is the academic adjustments. So the treatment is the general, no discrimination, and the academic adjustments are the actual accommodations. So The treatment of students in general is an A, B, C, and D of this, so no qualified student with a disability shall be discriminated against because of the disability or be excluded from participation. So what does this mean? So a student with a disability has to participate in all college programs. So if you're offering something at the college, the student with a disability has to be able to access it. It's not just the classroom, it's other things that are going on the campus. You have to take into consideration that the student has to have access to it by law. So the section B is participation by students in educational programs or activities not operated wholly by the college. So what does that mean? So let's say you have an internship program that is off campus. You have to ensure that you will have a student with a disability who's in your program, and they will have to do an internship. So that the outside agencies that we contract with as Cuny, we have to make sure that they also will provide accommodations to these students. And that is, we have to do that. There's no choice. You can't say, well, you can be in the program, but you can't do the internship, so maybe you shouldn't be in the program. That's not acceptable. The part C is the college may not, on the basis of disability, exclude any qualified handicap, that's the language, student from the course of study or particular educational program. So what does that mean? So it means that a student with a disability can choose whatever they want to study. You can't say, as Christian said in the video there, you can't say to a student, well, I think that because you use a wheelchair, that you should not pursue a degree in occupational therapy, because how will you get, really, how will you get around? Transportation may be an issue for you. That cannot be taken into consideration, okay? They can, as long as they qualify for that program, the person with a disability can pursue it. As long as they're doing well, they have to meet the academic standard, of course. So the D, this is part of section 504, the college shall operate its programs or activities in the most integrated setting properly. So that means, so I worked at a campus in the Bronx, which had a lot of landmark buildings, and there were functions that were in beautiful, halls that were New York City landmarks. They're beautiful. And one of them had, all of them have steps, had no elevators, and there were often functions that were there. I remember they had a function for veterans once, and they actually had to carry one of the veterans up the steps to get into the building. Now, I had nothing to do with that. I didn't even know what was going on, to be honest with you, and they wanted that to be in this beautiful hall, but it really should have been somewhere else. Now, the student was okay with it, she was all right with it, she enjoyed the event, she got into the building, they got her out of the building, but in truth, when you're planning, you really should be planning to make sure that everyone can get there. And it should be integrated. It wouldn't be appropriate in that case to say, well, we'll have a luncheon there, and then anyone who can't get into, we'll have another little luncheon in the lobby, so anyone who can't get up the stairs, that's not an integrated setting, and that should be avoided at all costs. So we get to academic adjustments, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. So academic adjustments, one of the requirements of this is that the college has to make academic modifications to the academic requirements. So the academic requirement is that the college has to demonstrate, has to be essential to the instruction. So let's say you have a student in a program and there are 5 assignments in the program. Well, are all of those assigned, they're all graded. So the rubric of the grade is that these 5 things are going to be graded. Well, are all of those 5 things essential to what the learning outcome is for the class? So you might have a student with a disability who can't do one of those 5 things, okay? So what you do? You look at it, you say, well, can I put an accommodation in place so that student can do that? And maybe yes, maybe no. If you can't, you would have to consult with the chair, with the faculty, and say, is this really an essential component of this class? Without this piece, can you say that student is not qualified to get a grade in this class? And that's a tricky question. It can be very, very tricky. I had a case in a campus that I worked on where a student was a studio film major, and he had double prosthesis. And there were things that he was not able to do. And it was like a war between the chair of the department and the disability office, because the student felt that some of those things he just couldn't do, but he could have an assistant with him and that person could do it. So we had to dig deep into every single piece of those classes that he had to take, Carlos remembers, and we had to figure out what we could put in place for him, and if we could put something in place for him to do it. There was one particular one that he had to make a video and carry the camera with him, and he couldn't do it. He couldn't carry it because of the balance. He could not carry anything, obviously. So anyway, we worked it out. He ended up graduating, but it was I have to say, it was it was my first year there too. It was fun. Lots of fun. Yeah, baptism by fire, right? So the other part, section B, is the college may not impose other rules that prohibit things. So for instance, the college can't have a rule like you cannot record a class, or no animals allowed in the building. You can't have a general rule like that, because could be that a student needs one of those things. So a college should not have general rules. Course examinations. So when you're testing a student to see what they've learned, a professor may be used to doing it one way. This is the way I test. There's 4 essays. The student is graded on that. Well, you might have a student who has a processing disorder, and really multiple choice is really the best way. Or another alternative to writing might be that the professor meet with the student for 20 minutes and ask the student verbally what the questions are and see how well they answer and if they know the material. That would be an alternative way. So you can't say this is the way I test and it has to stay like this. There's usually an alternative. It's not always easy, but sometimes it's really easy. So it depends. So auxiliary aids. So aids is something that will be provided to the student in order to, as an accommodation. So something like a recorder, a live scribe pen. I'm sure you've all heard of them. We have a lot of things now for students who are low hearing. We're actually getting many students on campus who are low hearing, not deaf. They don't communicate using sign language, but they are low hearing. So turn those radios down, take those headphones off. It's just very interesting how many young people have hearing loss just based on that. So we have little microphones, we have a lot of things. Other people know way more about that than I do, so they'll address that. But this would be an auxiliary aid. So the college, while we don't provide personal aids, we wouldn't give a student a hearing aid, something like that, but an auxiliary aid in the classroom, that is something that we do provide, and the student they loan that for the semester and then they do return it. So the college cannot say, oh, Bill, because you can't record the class and we don't have a recorder for you, so you can't take the class. We can't do that. We're bound to provide these aids. And they're not personal aids, by the way. It's not someone with you in the class. It's not an aid, person aid, but it's actually other things. So the general, how you request academic adjustments, the student would visit the disability office and provide us with documentation if necessary. If we can see that the student has a disability, we don't ask for documentation, at least I don't. Every campus does operate a little bit differently depending on the philosophical approach of the director. In general, if someone has a physical disability that is very obvious, we don't. We actually had an interesting, I have somebody right now on campus who is legally blind. And she's actually she was at the Cuny IT conference with me. She presented with us. And she's actually going on to graduate school. And she came and she asked me for documentation out of her file. And I looked, I said, you belong to the Commission for the Blind. I don't have any. All you gave us was your card. But the graduate, they're asking for documentation from her. And I said, I'm sorry, you'll have to figure it out because we actually didn't, ask her. She has her card from the Commission. That means that they have vetted her. We know that she's legally blind. So I said, I don't have any documentation. So it's an interactive process. Every case is different. There's no blanket, there's no menu, there's no blanket list of accommodations. And people will often say, even, I'm on a couple of listservs, and they'll say, show me in the ADA or 504 where it says that you can or you can't. That's not it. It's a civil rights legislation, so it's basic non-discrimination. And then you have to interpret that. That can sometimes be a little tricky. So that's it. That's all the league. We can all do better. We all know that. I won't even. We can all be doing everything better. So thank you so much, and I look forward to being part of the panel and answering your questions.
Thank you, Patricia.
Hi everyone, my name is Jessica Murray. I'm a developmental psychology PhD student at the Graduate Center, and I'm a Futures Initiative Fellow and a web developer for them. I have a copy of the slides available online if you would like to see them. The bit.ly link is there on the bottom right corner. That's bit.ly/ all caps CTLR18. So today I'm going to be talking about creating accessible web content, and this can apply to other types of content as well. Website lawsuits are kind of on the rise right now, so it's becoming an increasingly important issue. I think sometimes people don't really understand what accessible information fully means, or they have an idea that if text is highlightable and you can kind of copy and paste it, then that's accessible. If you have an alt tag for your images, then that's accessible, but it kind of goes beyond that. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the definitions and principles, and kind of also talk about accessibility thinking as well. So why it's important to make your content accessible. So according to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, accessible information has 4 qualities. It's perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So what does that mean exactly? Perceivable means that it's able to be perceived, not only by vision, but by hearing. A computer can perceive the information as well. So when we're talking about alt tags for images, that means that if I have my eyes closed and my screen reader is telling me what the alt tag is, then I understand what that image means. Operable means that you can navigate to the different parts of the information through a variety of means. So since I'm an able-bodied person, I can use my mouse to navigate around a website, but if I don't have that motor capability, then I'm going to need another way to operate a website. Information is understandable, so this means that you're writing in clear and concise language that can be understood by people with cognitive disabilities, all the way up to the 16th grade reading level and above that most of us read and write for. And robust means that it can be accessed through a variety of channels. So not only can I see the website on my computer, I can see it on my cell phone, I can print it if I want to, and it's all going to be readable in any format. So I've kind of compiled a list of 10 kind of qualities of accessible information from a variety of sources around the web. And I won't go back through these in too much detail, but they're there in the PowerPoint if you want to read them. Headings being in the correct order, number 2, is one that people tend to overlook a lot. The reason that this is important is that for people with visual disabilities that are using screen readers, if you're using a heading 3 style because you like the font size and the color or whatever, instead of using a heading 1, which is more appropriate, the screen reader is going to skip past some important information and go in the wrong order. So putting things in the correct hierarchy makes it legible for people that need screen readers, and it also makes it easy for you to make a table of contents, for example, or use that semantic information for your own purposes. Alt tags should convey meaning. Text should not be in an image format, or it should be presented alongside images that have text. Meaning is not conveyed through color alone. A lot of people are now using color coding as a tool for making things more understandable, but if you're not conveying that meaning in some other way, you're affecting the roughly 8% of people that have color blindness. Tabular data should always be presented along with graphs and charts. We do like to visualize information, and that makes it more understandable for people, but if you forget to include the actual numbers, people with visual disabilities cannot understand what's going on in the graphs and charts. Videos, just like images, should have meaningful descriptions. They should have captions or transcripts where available. Websites should be navigable by tabbing. That's an easy way to kind of see if you're on the right track as far as people being able to go through, navigate the website. And file names and links should be meaningful. It shouldn't just say, click here. What does that mean? What am I clicking to? And so these are kind of some of the most common accessibility problems. Inaccessible PDFs are a really big problem. Just because you can highlight text doesn't always mean that it's readable or it's understandable. So if we move on to this kind of idea of accessibility thinking, it's really more than just a checklist. Sometimes it's a negotiation between competing needs, like color coding is one example of that. So whenever possible, try to get feedback from students with disabilities in your class about their experience and ask them if they're able to access everything that they need. Also think about how different types of disabilities impact how the information is accessed. So these are kind of four main types of disabilities that could affect your teaching and any kind of content you put on the web. And also think about other factors that could impact how the information is accessed. Language barriers are a problem. So having text that's in a readable format that can be translated is very useful. People have varying access to technology and Wi-Fi internet connections. So thinking about like file sizes and how long it's going to take for people to download information is really important, because some people, we know a lot of students are actually doing their homework on their mobile phones on the way to and from school. They're trying to read stuff, and if those file sizes are really big, they're having a hard time downloading those. So pay attention to how many kilobytes those files are. Also, people have varying comfort levels with and familiarity with technology. And also think about the positive benefits those extend to everyone. So the information is going to be easier to understand and find. It's actually helps with search engine optimization and page speed loading if you include all of these accessibility features. Describing images can be a valuable skill, and you only have to make it accessible one time. And once you get into the habit, it will take less time as you keep doing it. And here's kind of a list of tools and tips for improving accessibility. Microsoft Word and Acrobat have included accessibility checkers. You can use the tab key, as I said, to test the order of your elements on your web page. There's a couple of Google Chrome extensions that can do an audit of your website. This is a really good kind of list for how to provide useful text alternatives, because sometimes people get confused about when they need an alt tag, if it's a decorative image, etc. So this is a really good resource. And also Hemingway app is one that I've been using a lot recently to kind of test like what reading level you're writing at. And I actually put in the syllabus statement of accessibility, and that is, I think it was at a 16th grade reading level, so you may want to kind of test it out in Hemingway app and see how complicated your writing is. So that's all I have today. Thank you.
How's this doing? We're good? All right. So two really quick things as I begin. The first is that I use they, them, and he, him pronouns. The second, as I begin, is that I am both a professor and a student with psychiatric disabilities, and I say that because I think a lot of times in talking about disability in our classroom, we erase certain disabilities of our students, but we also erase our own. And so I want to draw attention, I suppose, to the idea that it's not a one-way street in any respect, but also in this conversation and in this respect. So as Priscilla had mentioned earlier, I'm the project, we're not quite sure, associate for the Designing for All project at LaGuardia. And I want to say just a little bit about what we do, because I think it gives really good context for models, quite frankly, that are student-based, student-centered. Perla's awesome. That I think are super, super helpful. What we do is we strive to create inclusive design practices that we create with our students. And I use that sort of as a verb. Instead of saying inclusive design, I talk about inclusive design practices, because practices, if you think about design, you're going to think about things to memorize, things to master, and then you're going to be done, right? We like to consider ourselves experts in things and then move on, right? But this is something that requires sort of constant reflection, constant sort of self-analysis of the way that we're practicing our accessible pedagogy. And so I like to think of inclusive design practices because every conversation that Perla and I have, every conversation I have with Christian, with the other students that we have, we all learn more with each other. And I think that benefits, all of our learning habits. And so I want to call attention to this sort of as a verb rather than as a noun, something to master. And one of the reasons that I do that is because we at Designing for All really emphasize front-loading accessibility rather than using it as a retrofit. What do I mean by that? I mean that, yeah, sure, Some students are gonna, they know to come to you with their paper, and they know to come to you with the little envelope that they give you. And some students don't have access to that little envelope, whether it's because they don't have insurance, so they can't go to the disability services office and get what they need, right? So whether it's an access to insurance issue, or whether it's simply, well, I need an accommodation for my anxiety, but crap, my anxiety won't let me get it, right? It's something that happens to me on the daily, right? And so, this is the kind of thing that what we've been doing with our project is working with students to figure out ways to encourage faculty to make sure that we are sort of designing accessibility as inclusively as possible into every aspect of our course design, rather than waiting for a student that we're then going to pathologize, which is all kinds of makes my brain explode. And then we'll say, oh, well, this student, this pathologized student is a problem for my pedagogy, but rather, what happens when we flip it? What happens when we problematize our pedagogy to begin with and say, well, how do we make this as inclusive as possible from jump? How do we make this as inclusive as possible from jump, Jay? Well, there are lots of different ways, right? And so one of the things that I like to do, one of the sort of quick sort of methods to go here is really asking ourselves questions and reflecting on our assumptions. And so we ask students to do this all the time, right? What is this text arguing? What are the assumptions that the author is making? Things like this. And so doing that to our own pedagogy is super, super helpful. So saying, okay, what assumptions, what arguments is my syllabus making? When the disability section is the little bitty thing at the end of the syllabus that, we all know no one's going to read, versus when it's an accessibility section that not only includes, where the office is and where to go, but that also includes information about, many schools. At Queens College we had one stop, at LaGuardia we have single stop, that includes information about, hey, you need a Metro card? Here, go here. Hey, have you eaten today? Go here, right? Hey, here's Cuny Clear for free immigration services. Those kinds of things, also a crucial part of our accessibility practices. And putting that all, front-loading that in our syllabus, giving it, for lack of a non-capitalist term, prime real estate in our syllabus, super, super important for having students see what we prioritize, because when it's that little itty-bitty thing, when it's a PS to our syllabus, well, students know then that it's a PS in the back of our minds, rather than something that we are really prioritizing in our course design. So sort of figuring out, okay, how do we front load this in our syllabi? Also figuring out how do we front load this in our content selection, right? I often hear, oh, well, it's about, people hear disability or people hear accessibility and they say lowering standards, and I'm like, no. When we talk about content selection in terms of accessibility, we're talking about relevance. We've talked about retrofitting. You don't want to retrofit. You want to front load everything. Well, here's the second R that really comes up, which is relevance. What's relevant to our students? What's relevant when we're talking in a mostly white group of instructors, and what's relevant when we're talking to our mostly students of color student body, right? Where's the relevance, right? And when do students feel like we can emotionally link in to information, and when are we creating a wall simply with content that may be presented in uncritically, for example, white ways, right? How does that also create access barriers? And so when we're thinking about accessibility, for me, the way that we racialize disability is tremendously important for us to sort of think about as we even pick what we're going to read, or pick how we present what we're going to read, or what we're going to do in our classrooms. And then there's assignment design, and then there's participation standards, and then there's assessment practices, right? And so when we underline and bold in our syllabus, you can't eat here, or no cell phones, or you have to attend and be on time, well, crap, my anxious ass is going to say, well, if I'm late, I might as well not show up, Or if I can't get out of bed because my depression is too bad, well, maybe I need to drop this class because there's no other way for me to access it, right? But Perla was talking about it absolutely beautifully. One of the things to do is really crack open what we think of as participation. And this is where we get a lot of hesitation because we're comfortable, right, with the ways that we know of teaching, which is fabulous. Being comfortable is fun. But this is the exciting part where we get to be creative in our course design. Again, for me, figuring out, to address the question that we had earlier, sort of shoving in at the end there, how do we have an active learning atmosphere, right, where everybody's interacting, but also you have students participating in multiple ways? It's really fun, right? A lot of times we think of this stuff as a burden and stuff. It's really fun to think, okay, I'm gonna have group work. Crap. What about my students with anxiety? What about my students on the autism spectrum who might be like, no, right? What about these students? And how do we have an active classroom with these students? Turns out there are as many ways as there are students and more, right? One of the things that I do is my students always know, because I talk about it from jump, that if they're absolutely hard no, I will not raise my hand, write something down. You know, how are you learning? How are you interacting? You tell me. If it's by writing something down, sweet. If it's by typing it on your phone, sweet. And then let me know. Some students, slip me a note after class, every class, because they're not trying to talk, but they're trying to participate. And turns out, at the end of term, those are students who volunteer to give really badass presentations, the ones who haven't said a word, the entire class. They're the ones who say, you know what, this is a safe spot. This is a really safe place for me to say, okay, sweet, I'm gonna try something that is absolutely terrifying to me. And so I wanna leave us sort of with something that I've developed as part of our DFA project. One of the things that we've been doing is the faculty, in conjunction with our students, and sort of taking advice always from our students, taking the lead from them, is we've been developing different projects to sort of pilot in our classrooms to see, well, how does it work? Does it make it more accessible for our students? And I've been sort of piloting in a very highly interactive theater class a consent-based mode of participation. A consent-based pedagogy where my students wear, and I wear it too, wear name cards with a see-through little, thing. And some are red, some are yellow, some are green. They're their little traffic lights. And the way we always describe them, and my students pick up this language really quickly, we describe it as, if you're green, if you're showing your green card, you're good to go, you're like, ready to do the weird, wacky things that come with theater. If you're yellow, you might be tired. You might have been up at 3 a.m. for your math class, right? But, you're tentatively, you can try it. And if you're red, you're like, nah, I'm not trying to really interact with human beings. And again, the principal concern that I hear about this consent-based mode of participation is, well, everyone's going to pick red, and they're going to game the system, and they're going to sit in the back, and they're going to say, okay, it's fine, because you said we can be red, right? What I've actually found happens is that when we have a conversation about, hey guys, when we're feeling yellow and when we're feeling red, let's figure out what we do. What do you feel like doing when you're red, when you're yellow? What do you need to do? How do you need to learn? We all have red and yellow days. Red and yellow days most days, right? How do we want to learn? And they come up with incredible things. And then they support the crap out of each other. I had a young man last term volunteer to give his monologue, to perform. So not only like saying an answer, but to perform his freaking monologue in front of the class, and he did it on red. And one of my other boys raises his hand, we were giving critiques, and he says, man, I notice you're on red, and I just wanted to say that you're really brave, and I really admire that. And sure enough, then there's a slew of students who are on red who present their monologues. And there's a slew of students who are on red who say, you know what, oh sweet, this is gonna be great. And on the flip, sometimes they're on red and they're like, it's cute that you think I can peer review today, I won't. But I will stand in the corner with my own work and kind of slip over to you, the instructor, once in a while. And, hey, what do you think about this particular line? I'm stuck here. Help me. You'll be my peer. You'll review with me, right? And so for me, what we've found sort of working with our students is that we gotta trust them a little bit more. I would suggest a lot more, right? And that sense of vulnerability and risk that we bring into the classroom, if we're explicit about that, often it creates better content, often it creates sharper analysis, right? And so really what we found is one of the questions that Perla keeps asking of herself, of other students through our project is, what makes you feel comfortable participating in a class? And so, you know, Perla and the other students in the project can generate lots of questions like this. But I would encourage us as we sort of move forward, not to come away with a sense of answers, but to come away with those types of questions. Well, what does make my students feel comfortable participating in my class? What does make my students feel comfortable learning well and taking risks? Those kinds of questions that our students are asking are, I think, the kinds of questions that can really push our pedagogy towards inclusivity. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. And speaking of questions.
I see what you did there.
That was a really good
That was
ending.
a good one.
Are there any questions for our panelists? Perla.
I have a comment that I forgot to mention.
The mic, is it on? The red button on the lower right.
Hello. I have a comment that I actually forgot to bring up. It's regarding attendance, because I do have, I'm bipolar, I have my depressive days, and I also suffer with generalized anxiety. There are times where I get ready at home and I just can't get myself out of the apartment. I'm like ready to go with my coat, my backpack, and I just can't get in. And there are some times that I get so I live in the Bronx. It's an hour and a half to get to LaGuardia. There are times where I make it all the way to in front of the classroom and I just can't get in. And even though I'm sitting there listening to the lecture, I'm absent. So I think we should rethink the way that students learn in that way, because the only reason why I haven't failed any classes is because I've been lucky to have professors who are willing to accommodate me. So as long as I'm doing my work and doing well, then they'll let me miss a day or two. And at LaGuardia specifically, if you miss more than 3 days, you automatically fail the course. And it doesn't matter if you have like an A so far, you just fail.
Yeah, and Perla brings up a really good point, if I may follow up on that. One of the things that all my students know is, hey guys, here are LaGuardia's standards for participation, because they need to know that. That's super important, because it also affects their financial aid, things like this. And so, hey guys, here's the standards that the school has, that the department has. Here's how it affects your financial aid. And here's how, if you can't get into the door, you and I can talk about this. And here's how we can figure out a way for you to participate on those days that you're just, whew, how can you participate? How can you come to class without coming to class? Sort of challenging what we mean when we say, I'm present, right? And so sort of figuring that out with my students rather than sort of it's something that I do to my students or for my students, that's been really, really helpful. Thank you, Pearl.
Questions, anyone? Thoughts? Lucinda.
All right, I have a question. I'm always going to have. The big issue that everybody's dealing with is making all those PDFs accessible, right? So you were talking about that. I assume there are different kinds of software and stuff like that. Are you all engaged in projects to go back and fix a lot of these things on your website? Is that what's happening now on the campuses? I mentioned this particularly with regard to the degree mapping project that everybody should be working on. A lot of the colleges, I know this was true at LaGuardia, they had degree maps for all of their degree programs, but none of them were accessible. So they've had to kind of go back in and or pull them all down and put them back up. So I was wondering how that's going. And does it require a certain kind of software? Did I miss that?
Well, the Acrobat has a built-in accessibility checker, so that can tell you what's
Whether-
wrong with the PDF. Usually you have to go back to the original software that you used to create the PDF. So if that came through Microsoft Word or some other software, you need to run the accessibility checker there and make the corrections there.
Okay. Are a lot of you all doing that? I mean, are you working on this across the board? Because I think there's a lot of stuff that needs to be fixed out there, right?
Yeah, and unfortunately, I mean, it kind of goes back to this kind of design versus accessibility issue where there's competing needs. Maybe for something like a career map or a timeline, you want something with a lot of visuals, but those aren't always easy to
Right.
read by a screen reader. So you could create an accessible version that's just for screen readers, and that's a suitable alternative, I think.
Thank you.
I guess I'm wondering about how you do student outreach. Like how do you, because I mean, it's still, I mean, as the first speaker mentioned, it's still required that a student go to the Office of Accessibility to get accommodations. So how do you, and as we also know, there's probably more students that have accessibility needs. Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I mean, it sounds like maybe you're talking to your fellow students. I'm just wondering what mechanisms you have in place for student outreach, given that there's probably a lot of students out there that have accessibility needs that aren't being met.
Funny you should ask. So we have sort of two main student components to this project that we're running. The first that we're not running around like small chickens without heads trying to figure out, but similar, is a survey. Where the students are developing a survey for their fellow students to sort of lay the groundwork for, okay, these are the needs that aren't being met, and these are the needs that perhaps we're not expecting that are occurring, but and that we're planning on having student street teams sort of going out and doing some outreach with that, but that's more of a collection than a pulling in. So this is the second part of the Designing for All project with our students. They're all going to be doing public-facing projects with us. One of our students is very interested in theater. I have nothing to do with that. And he is very interested in producing, a one-act play regarding his experiences. Many of our students are really into speaking, some are into writing, things like this. And so they're going to be doing public-facing things that because they're designing it, they're choosing what their project will be, what their medium will be. They're going to hopefully sort of be bringing more students into the fold through that who also may not identify right away as having a disability or such. And Priscilla, you're wanting to say something too?
Thank you so much. I just was actually wanting to invite Patricia to also answer this question. Thanks.
Yes, that's a great question. Anyone who works in a disability office at Cuny, we don't just serve the students that walk through the door. It's really important. I mean, I'm here today, but there are other people from disability offices who are also here today. We make our presence known on campus, and anywhere where I've ever worked, everyone knows me, and I know it's the same for my colleagues. We attend admissions fairs, we attend transfer fairs, we table, at Baruch Ryan now, we have screens all over campus. I'm constantly advertising the department. In the year that I've been there, our enrollment has gone up 19%. And it's important, it's really important to not just say, find us. I mean, that's really a big part of our job. It's not just writing accommodations and making sure the students, we're a resource for faculty, we are a resource for staff, and constantly professors stop by with that question. There's a student in my class, and I know that there's something that I could be doing for them, and they have not identified as a student with a disability. What can I do? And that's a tough one. It is a tough one because I have had an experience where a professor suggested to a student that they had a disability, and the student went berserk. So that's a very sensitive thing. So usually my advice to the professor is just to, have a sit down and say, hey, did you have services in high school? Did you ever have extra time to do assignments? And when they say yeah, I'd say, hey, you know what, you can get that here, and then walk them perhaps to the office without pushing it, because it is many people are stigmatized. It's a stigma often to have a disability, and you want to walk away from that when you're in a new environment. You know, even if you move neighborhoods, if you've had a bad experience somewhere, you want to move somewhere and be like, no one knows me. No one knows that I had that horrible boyfriend or husband or partner or whatever. So it's the same thing with people with disabilities. So yes, we do advertise as much as we can, and we try our best. But not everyone. It's a choice. I mean, I believe in it's a choice. People. You could have a disability and not need any services. So, you know, you're okay. You're a B student, okay, so I could be an A, but I'm good without having services. I don't want to be, you know, I don't want anything extra, so.
Thanks, Patricia. So, we are going to actually move on to our table activities, so everyone gets a chance to focus on some specific topics and also discuss with each other, brainstorm together. And Mari, you want to tell us a little bit more, or
Sure.
who's going to tell us about the table?
Oh, but before that, round of applause to
Oh, yes.
So the group discussion